In today's video, we are talking about some common microneedling mistakes I have made myself and see being made quite frequently, and of course, how to avoid them. Now, if you've been here for a bit, you know I'm a big fan of microneedling. I have microneedled for about 16 years now, and it has made a huge difference in the health and appearance of my skin. In fact, I am such a big fan of microneedling. I have a whole playlist on microneedling, which I will of course link down below. However, I'm not the only fan of microneedling. Many dermatologists, plastic surgeons, and other experts agree that microneedling can be a great anti-aging treatment for the skin because it can help facilitate more collagen and elastin production.
I'm a big fan of microneedling. Why? Because microneedling causes the skin to respond to those tiny little needles that are piercing the skin by a healing response. Healing response means collagen production.
Microneedling is a super popular skin treatment, and for good reason. It can stimulate collagen, it can help with scarring, and it can do so much more.
Microneedling is actually something where there has been tons of research on it. So there's like hundreds of papers on the benefits of microneedling. So you can pretty much count on it being an effective thing for your skin.
Now, microneedling, of course, can be performed in a plastic surgeon or dermatologist office, or depending on the state you live in, can even be performed by an esthetician. And I do think it is a good idea, if you've never had a microneedling treatment, to get your first one from a professional. But beyond that, I truly believe that microneedling is something we can easily learn to do ourselves in the privacy of our own home, as long as certain things are being taken into consideration and certain mistakes are being avoided, which is what we're talking about today. Now, before I go any further, I have to give you my usual disclaimer. If you are thinking of microneedling at home, please, as always, do your own research. Don't just do what I say. Always, always, always do your own research. I'm not a microneedling expert. I'm just sharing with you what I have learned over the past 16 years of doing my own microneedling treatments at home. But again, please do your own research. And as I mentioned earlier, I do think it is a good idea, if you've never had a microneedling treatment, to get at least your first one from a professional. That way you can see what it's all about. Now, as I mentioned earlier, I have a whole playlist on microneedling. So I won't go into too much detail about the benefits of microneedling, but I briefly want to cover the different forms of microneedling, because I believe not realizing that, first of all, there are different forms of microneedling, and not understanding the different forms is what leads to many of the microneedling mistakes I have seen. I actually have a whole video on the different forms of microneedling. It's a bit old, but I will link it down below regardless. But in a nutshell, there are 3 different forms of microneedling. There is nanoneedling, which, as confusing as the name is, does not involve actual needles, but instead microscopic silicone-tipped cones. Since nanoneedling does not involve actual needles piercing the skin, not much can go wrong. So we won't even talk about nanoneedling in this video. But aside from nanoneedling, there's also cosmetic needling and medical microneedling. What differentiates cosmetic needling from medical microneedling is the depth of needle penetration. So let's briefly take a look at the anatomy of our skin. We have the stratum corneum, the very outer layer of our skin, basically dead skin cells. That is actually the layer of skin nanoneedling addresses. Below the stratum corneum, we have the epidermis. The epidermis is avascular, meaning it does not contain blood vessels. It is basically composed of keratinized, stratified squamous epithelium. Below the epidermis is the dermis. In the dermis, we do find blood vessels, and we also find collagen and elastin fibers. And then below the dermis is the hypodermis, or subcutaneous tissue. So the depth of needle penetration. And with that, of course, the layer of skin these needles are going to enter in is what differentiates cosmetic needling from medical microneedling. And this is really important to remember, because not only do these two different forms of microneedling have a different outcome, but because we are entering different layers of the skin, speed of healing, and with that, frequency of application is going to differ. What we can apply before, during, and after our session is going to differ. And even the cartridge we want to use for cosmetic needling is going to be different than the one we want to use for medical microneedling. So let's take a look at cosmetic needling and medical microneedling separately. In cosmetic needling, we use a needle length of 0.2 to 0.3 millimeters. And this is actually another mistake I see being made quite frequently. It is 0.2 to 0.3 millimeters, not 2.0 to 3.0 millimeters. I'm going to show you the difference actually. So I have an adjustable stamp right here, which can be adjusted anywhere from 0 to 3 millimeters. And I'm going to have to put my glasses on for this one. But in cosmetic needling, we use a needle length of 0.2 to 0.3 millimeters. Not centimeters, not inches, but millimeters. I have this dialed in right now at 0.25 millimeters. And you can barely see these needles. They are tiny. Now I'm going to dial it in at 2.5 millimeters and show you the difference. There is quite a difference. So this is 2.5 millimeters. This is not what we use for cosmetic needling. In cosmetic needling, we use a needle length of 0.2 to 0.3 millimeters. At that needle length, we pierce the stratum corneum, again the outer layer of our skin, and we barely enter into the epidermis. Again, the epidermis is avascular. It does not contain blood vessels, nor does it contain collagen or elastin fibers. So while in cosmetic needling, we are piercing tiny little holes into our skin with, again, a needle length of 0.2 to 0.3 millimeters, which I have right here, 0.25 millimeters. We are barely entering into the epidermis. So first of all, cosmetic needling should not bleed because there are no blood vessels in the epidermis. And because there are no collagen or elastin fibers in the epidermis, cosmetic needling does not facilitate collagen and elastin production. Cosmetic needling is for product penetration. Now, there are some experts who believe that cosmetic needling does over time impact collagen and elastin production. And that may well be. Again, I am not a microneedling expert, but looking at the anatomy of the skin, that doesn't quite make sense to me. In my opinion, cosmetic needling is mostly for product penetration. So by creating tiny little channels, we allow product we applied before or after our cosmetic needling session to slip in just a bit deeper, but not deep enough to have to worry about something like a foreign body reaction. Therefore, when we cosmetic needle, we can apply within reason and just about anything we would like to penetrate just a bit deeper. And of course, having certain products or ingredients penetrate just a bit deeper can be immensely beneficial. Because cosmetic needling doesn't cause a lot of trauma to the skin, it can be done quite frequently. Personally, I like to cosmetic needle once a week. Some people do it twice a week or even 3 times a week. It just depends on skin sensitivity. So that is cosmetic needling. Medical microneedling, or we'll talk about the cartridge in a second. Medical microneedling uses a needle length of 0.5 millimeters or longer. At 0.5 millimeters or longer, we again pierce the stratum corneum. We enter through the epidermis into the dermis. In the dermis, again, we find blood vessels as well as collagen and elastin fibers. So medical microneedling can first of all bleed a bit because we do have blood vessels in the dermis, and because we have collagen and elastin fibers in the dermis, medical microneedling helps to facilitate collagen and elastin production, which is why it is also known as collagen induction therapy. So when our 0.5 millimeter or longer needles enter into the dermis, they create what we call a controlled injury. The body responds to this controlled injury with a cascade of reactions, which eventually lead to more collagen and elastin production. But of course, this cascade of reactions takes time. So medical microneedling, unlike cosmetic needling, should not be done frequently. In fact, it should not be done more frequently than every 4 to 6 weeks to allow the body to go through this cascade of reactions and to actually have time to produce collagen and elastin. Because we actually enter into the dermis in medical microneedling, we have to be very careful about what we are using before, during, and after a medical microneedling session. Now, I have made several videos, like I said, I have a whole playlist on microneedling, but I have made several videos in which I talk about what is okay to be used before, during, and after medical microneedling and what isn't. I will link those videos down below. So in medical microneedling, unlike cosmetic needling, we have to be very careful what we apply before, during, and even after a session, because certain things we don't want to penetrate into the dermis. Also in medical microneedling, cleanliness is uber important. Now, cleanliness is important when cosmetic needling as well, but especially when medical microneedling, we want to first of all make sure to start with a clean canvas. We don't want to microneedle sunscreen, makeup, dirt and grime, or numbing cream into our skin. We also want to make sure that our work area is nice and clean and our hands are nice and clean. Now, some people like to wear gloves when medical microneedling. Personally, I find that a bit redundant, but I always have some alcohol or disinfectant nearby, so if need be, I can always disinfect my hands again. And then lastly, of course, we want to make sure that our equipment is sanitized as well. Now, of course, if we are using something like a doctor pen, we want to make sure to use a fresh cartridge every single time. I get that question quite frequently. Do I have to use a fresh cartridge for every treatment? I would say yes. That way we are making sure that our needles are nice and sterile, but also that they are nice and sharp, because they do blunt with use. Now, of course, if you use a stamp or a derma roller, you're not going to use a fresh one every single time. So we have to make sure to sterilize our derma roller or stamp really well after each use. And then I would say after 10, max 15 uses, we do want to get a new derma roller or stamp, because again, the needles will blunt with use. Now let's talk about cartridges. One confusion I hear about quite often. Just the other day, I got an email from one of you saying, I medical microneedled, I followed your video, I went 1 millimeter deep, but unlike you, I didn't get red at all, I had no pinpoint bleeding, I had no downtime, I feel like I didn't get any results from my medical microneedling session. That is most likely because the wrong cartridge was used. Now, right now, we are talking about using a doctor pen and cartridges. So when cosmetic needling, we want to use a cartridge that has a higher amount of needles or pins. So for the M8S, for example, when I cosmetic needle, I use a cartridge that has 36 needles. When I medical microneedle with the M8S, I use a cartridge that has fewer needles, like this one right here, that has 18 needles. Now this can be quite confusing because the depth of penetration is of course determined right here on the dial. So if I cosmetic needle, I will dial this in at, let's say, 0.25 millimeters. Regardless, I still want to use a cartridge with more needles. Think about it this way. If you step on a nail, just one nail, with your bare foot, it is going to go straight into that foot and it's going to hurt. If you step on a bed of nails, it's going to hurt, but they are not going to penetrate very deeply. Similar concept. So while the depth of penetration is regulated right here on this dial, the number of needles in a cartridge still makes a difference. So if I medical microneedle with a 36-pin cartridge or even higher 42-pin cartridge, even if I put this on 1 millimeter, because there are so many needles in the cartridge, I'm not going to get the same penetration as if there are fewer needles. The same is true the other way around. I have made the mistake when cosmetic needling. I once cosmetic needled and I didn't pay attention and I grabbed a cartridge, I think it was an 18-pin cartridge, and I put this on 0.25 millimeters. I popped my 18-pin cartridge on and I thought, this hurts a lot more than usually. And I got really red and I had quite a bit of downtime, even though again, I only had this dialed in at 0.25 millimeters. But because I had fewer pins or fewer needles in my cartridge, there was a bit more penetration. I hope that makes sense. So for cosmetic needling, I personally choose a cartridge with a higher amount of needles or pins. For medical microneedling, I personally choose a cartridge that has fewer pins or needles. Now, of course, if I'm using a derma roller or stamp, this is irrelevant because I will have however many needles my tool has. So this only matters if we are using something like a doctor pen that actually gives us the choice of different cartridges. So let's see, we covered the different forms of microneedling and with that frequency. Now, while when it comes to medical microneedling, the more common mistake I see is wanting to medical microneedle more frequently than every 4 to 6 weeks. Because we get impatient, right? And we think if a little is good, more is better. I'm definitely guilty of that. So while that is a more common mistake I see, wanting to medical microneedle too frequently, every once in a while I get an email from somebody saying something like, I medical microneedled in January and then again in August, and I got no results. So just like we don't want to medical microneedle too frequently, we want to make sure the body has time to heal and to actually produce collagen and elastin, but we also don't want to do it so infrequently that it doesn't matter. So personally, I like to compare medical microneedling to lifting weights. If I really want to grow my bicep and I go to the gym and I do heavy bicep curls every day, I am going to get hurt and my bicep is not going to grow. But if I lift really heavy with my bicep, let's say in January, and then I do nothing again with my bicep until August, my bicep is also not going to grow. So I want to make sure to find the sweet spot, not too frequently, but also not so infrequently that I'm not going to see any results. Now, another mistake I see being made quite often is wanting to go too deep. And when I first started microneedling, I was definitely guilty of that. Again, I think if a little is good, more is better. So 16 years ago, we didn't know much about microneedling at all. In fact, these devices didn't exist. The only devices we had back then, or tools back then, were derma rollers. And I was a big fan of Dr. Fernandez. If you're not familiar with Dr. Fernandez, he is the pioneer of microneedling or derma rolling. And I'm not sure if he has changed his approach, but back then his approach was definitely a bit aggressive. So I remember purchasing a derma roller with 2 millimeter or even 2.5 millimeter needles and going to town. Not a good idea. Now, while in medical microneedling, I do want to enter into the dermis. That does start to happen with a needle length of 0.5 millimeters. Now, I might want to go a tiny bit deeper, let's say 1 millimeter. At 1 millimeter, I am definitely in the dermis, where again, collagen and elastin fibers are found. So there is no reason to go 2 or 2.5 millimeters deep if we are medical microneedling to induce more collagen and elastin. Going too deep just creates more trauma. The body has to heal but it doesn't give us more benefits. The only time it would be beneficial to go a bit deeper is when treating scars, such as acne scars or keloid scars. And then lastly, of course, technique is very important. And when I first started microneedling, to be honest, my technique was not the greatest. Now, while there are different ways to microneedle, personally, I find it safest when using a doctor pen to use a stamping technique. While it is not the fastest technique, again, I personally feel it is the safest to avoid micro tears. And then when I use a derma roller, I like to lift the roller after every pass, rather than to keep it in contact with the skin and to keep moving it back and forth. And then I also try to be mindful to not over-treat an area. So these are some microneedling mistakes I see being made quite frequently. And like I said, I've made some of these myself. But I truly believe that a lot of these mistakes stem from, first of all, not realizing that there are different forms of microneedling, and secondly, not understanding the different forms of microneedling. So I really hope this video was helpful. Any questions or comments, please leave them down below. I always love to hear from you. If I forgot to mention any mistakes, leave them down below. And I would love to know, do you microneedle at home? If so, do you cosmetic needle, medical microneedle, or both? Let us know in the comments. Thank you so much for being here. Until next time, bye.